Hello everyone, and welcome to the content presentation for week 5. My name is Karen Mears, and I'll be taking you through this week's information. This presentation will cover an open summary of our different sources for this week, which include the textbook Chapter 7 on conformity and textbook Chapter 8 on group processes, and finally, the two articles, which are The Myth of Conformity, Adolescence and Abstention from Unhealthy Drinking Behaviors by Rees and Wallace in 2014, and Exploring Social Identity Theory and the Black Sheep Effect Among College Student Athletes and Non-Athletes by Hawley, Hosch, and Bovard in 2014. After review of each of these sources, I will get into more detail about 5 topics, which include conformity, compliance, obedience, social influence, and group interaction. Finally, I will post 2 questions for you to answer on the discussion board. Chapter 7 explains how social influences are automatic. But when looking more deeply into this, researchers in social psychology take a closer look at 3 forms of influence that vary in the amount of pressure that they put on an individual. These are conformity, compliance, and obedience. Conformity focuses on how people change their perceptions, behaviors, and opinions to make them consistent with group norms. People conform for many reasons, but especially because they want to be right or because they might fear being ostracized by their group. Studies show that majority influence and minority influence play a part in why people conform as well. The text reviews Moscovici's theory, which says that majorities are powerful because of their numbers, but minority influencers receive power based on the style of their behavior. Culture is another variable in conformity, which will be discussed further. Chapter 7 also discusses compliance. Compliance focuses on changes in behavior that come about by direct requests, social pressures, and influence obedience. Social pressures also influence obedience. Obedience is behavior change that comes from commands of authority. As we know from our first week of study, Milgram's research shows that sometimes there are forces of destructive obedience which influence people. Chapter 7 concludes by discussing the continuum of social influence and highlights how the social impact theory explains compliance. This theory also explains that social influence depends on the strength, immediacy, and number of source people relative to the target. Additionally, the chapter also mentions how human nature plays a role in this conformity. Chapter 8 takes a look at social influence in the context of groups. Casson and colleagues explain that a group is a set of people who interact over time, and they have a shared identity or goal, and these people, when they adjust to groups, they need to figure out how that group works. Key features of groups that they need to know about include roles, norms, and cohesiveness. Culture can play a role in each of these areas as well. Next, the chapter takes a look at how individuals and groups behave when others are around. Social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation can occur in groups. Other processes are specific to groups and their performance. In groups, sometimes process loss takes place. This is a reduction in group performance because of obstacles created by the group, such as problems with coordination and motivation. Process gains can take place too. That's when the performance of the group outperforms those of individuals. There are other issues that cause division in groups, and sometimes group polarization and groupthink have negative impacts on groups. Sometimes groups have conflicts due to mixed motives and social dilemmas. However, negotiation is a tool that can be used to try to reach an integrative agreement and help with these conflicts. The first article, The Myth of Conformity, Adolescence and Abstention from Unhealthy Drinking Behaviors by Rees and Wallace in 2014, is an excellent example of an article about social influence. As mentioned in Chapter 7, majority and minority influences often have an impact on an individual's decisions. In this case, the study was done to find out if adolescent friend groups with pro-drinking norms would influence someone to drink if the individual has a minority of non-drinking friends. Interestingly, this study found out that the non-drinking adolescents with one or more non-drinking friends and a majority group of drinkers show that they can abstain from alcohol. In other words, minority influence was enough for them to keep from being pressured into their drinking behavior. The next article by Hawley, Hosch, and Bovard, called Exploring Social Identity Theory and the Black Sheep Effect Among College Student Athletes and Non-Athletes, fits well into social influence and group processes. This research study highlights the black sheep effect, which means that group members are more likely to show harsher treatment towards one of their own group members who bring negative attention to their group. If an individual deviates from acceptable group norms, the benefit of in-group favoritism starts to decrease. In their study on the extent to which college student athletes and a comparison group of non-athletes would demonstrate in-group favoritism or in-group bias, showed that there was an overall leniency effect for student athletes compared to non-athletes. But when looking at out-of-group bias, the researchers found that higher punishment and higher negative reflections were made about the university if individuals in a study were described as student athletes. The findings show how the athletic status of a student and context can relate to judgments of deviant student athletes. As you can see by the chapter readings and articles, social influence is far-reaching in individuals and groups. Next, I will be going into more detail over 5 main points covered in the reading: conformity, compliance, obedience, social influence, and group interaction. Conformity, compliance, and obedience are impacted by social influences from a person, a group, or institution. Conformity is a tendency to alter perceptions, opinions, or behaviors that are in line with group norms. The reasons why people conform include informational reasons, such as the need to be right that I mentioned before, and normative reasons. Fear of being left out is considered a normative influence. Majority influence pressures are dependent often on the group size, known social norms, presence of an ally, and gender. Minority influence, or the process by which dissenters create change in a group, encourages others to become curious and rethink their positions. As mentioned previously, the study done by Reese and Wallace highlights the importance of minority influences, particularly when non-drinking adolescents with one or more non-drinking friends and a majority group of drinkers show that they can abstain from alcohol. In addition to majority and minority influences, culture plays a role in conformity, with collectivist cultures seeking social harmony and individualistic cultures seeking autonomy. The next point is about compliance. Compliance takes place when people change behavior because of a direct request. Sometimes how a request is worded can make a difference. The norm of reciprocity, or treating others as they treat us, can influence people to comply as well. Keep in mind that different cultures have different norms. There are several sequential request strategies in the literature to get people to comply, such as the foot in the door strategy. This is to start with a small request and have the person answer it, something they can't refuse, and then request more. Lowballing is another example. This takes place in 2 steps: agreeing with a request, then increasing the size of the request by sharing the hidden costs. Finally, compliance techniques work best when they are hidden from view because feeling manipulated can breed anger. Obedience is our next point. Obedience is important to look at when discussing pressures to conform. As we were discussing in the first week, Milgram's study shows that obedience can be very destructive at times. Some factors influence obedience, and these are proximity, characteristics of the victim, novel situations, defiant confederates, and other variables such as those. Interestingly, follow-up studies on Milgram's study show that obedience is declining, and gender is not a factor in the level of obedience. It is important to note that social impact theory can help to explain conformity, compliance, and obedience. Social influence and social impact are next. Social impact theory says that social influence is a function of strength, immediacy, and number. According to Casson and colleagues in 2017, strength includes a status or relationship to a target person and immediacy focused on the source's proximity in time and space to the person. Number refers to the idea that as the number of sources increase, so does their influence to a point. Social impact theory suggests that people sometimes resist social pressure. The black sheep effect is a notable idea connected to social impact and resistance. Hawley, Hosch, and Bovard's study explain that group members are likely to display harsher treatment towards one of their own who bring negative attention to their group. When group members deviate from acceptable group norms, the benefits of in-group favoritism declines. Group interaction is our next point of study. A group is defined as a set of people who interact over time and have common goals, faith, or identity, according to Caston and colleagues in 2017. Social influence plays a role in group dynamics, including the promotion of social uniformity and compliance through the use of social rewards and social disincentives. That's according to the Rees-Wallace article. Better group performance is noted in the literature when members' roles are clear, without conflict, assigned appropriately, and when the group norms are understood. In contrast, group decision-making can be negatively impacted by a group polarization, groupthink, and concurrence. When groups experience conflict, subordinate identity is a way to find common ground between the groups in conflict. This includes gaining an understanding of the other group's perspective, cultural norms, and values so that negotiations can succeed through integrative agreements. Finally, in summary, social influence explains behavior on many levels in both individuals and in groups. Conformity, compliance, and obedience are impacted by social influences from an individual, group, or institution. Social identity theory is frequently used as a model to study social influence on individuals and groups. Studies on groups show that group processes impact performance, group decisions, and negotiations. Finally, conformity can be related to the Christian life because we are asked to live differently than the majority. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." Finally, here are the 2 questions for the discussion board this week. As you probably know, group projects present many challenges, particularly when the groups are formed in online classes. Based on what you know about the group processes, what strategies can you use to ensure that your online group performs well on a project together? The next question is, the pressure to conform to the ways of the world can be overwhelming. The Bible encourages Christians to follow God's advice no matter what the world says about it. What scriptures or biblical examples can you give that support conforming to God's word despite pressures to give in? Thank you for your time, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.